What happens to a person when his consciousness goes beyond life? John Ren-Lewis, a clinical death survivor, claims that his experience revealed not just the mysteries of the afterlife, but gave a unique understanding of the very essence of existence. There are no meetings with angels or saving tunnels of light in his story. Instead, he found himself in a place where time and space had disappeared, and he himself had become just a piece of vastness. What is the secret of this incredible experience? John Ren-Lewis is a researcher with a lively mind and an independent outlook. Such people often discover something unusual, and he succeeded. And in one of the most difficult areas of science and religion, he thought about the fundamental questions of the universe. What is the meaning of human life? Is it possible to know yourself? Is there life beyond death? And why is the shining void so important? His experience is unique. He did not survive clinical death, but found himself in a space where others linger only for a moment. What he said is not unique. Many are looking for a way to God consciousness through spiritual practices. Some believe that they were born with him. But Ren-Lewis did not acknowledge his existence at all. Moreover, by the age of 60, he believed that this consciousness was imposed on him. Unsurprisingly, his perception of this experience was very different from the generally accepted one. John believed in the creative power of humanity, believing that a religious worldview should be based on it. Science and technology are constantly developing, which means that faith should not be based only on blind worship of God, but also based on real, conscious principles. He was convinced that the mind and work of man would lead to the achievement of immortality. 1983, Thailand. On the bus, John was joined by a young man, neatly dressed with a friendly smile. He helped with the luggage and gave me some candy. It turned out that it was a thief who had simply poisoned him. John ended up in the hospital, dying in a hospital bed. Later, he pondered why his near-death experience was different from others. He wasn't floating near the ceiling, watching his body from a height. I didn't fly through the tunnel to the bright light. His whole life did not flash before his eyes. No one met him, and he didn't talk to anyone. Instead, he found himself in a void, beyond time and space. But he says it was, at the same time, the most intense, blissful life I've ever known. However, the most unusual consequence of this experience, which, according to him, has not been described anywhere before, is the constant feeling as if the upper part of his skull had been removed, and his brain was in the vast expanses of space. In the first days after his return, he touched his head more than once, checking if his cranial top was in place. Another consequence of his experience is the feeling of being like a boundless darkness, of which his 60-year-old body and mind are a part. This part is emerging from the darkness at every moment. In one of these moments, he is John. In the other, emptiness. While he is John, he first happily realizes his existence, then acts, creating what happens. But this perception is not filled with solemnity. It is soft, calm, unruffled. Now what is happening seems natural, and the previous state of consciousness is clouded. This stroboscopic perception is expressed in the fact that John periodically plunges into worries, forgetting about the emptiness of darkness, but then suddenly realizes that something is missing and remembers his connection with it. Ren-Lewis believed that every person has a memory of their true identity, but from birth it is almost completely forgotten. However, shocks like near-death experiences instantly awaken her, and after that, the memory begins to arise again and again. The initial shock passed quite quickly. John noticed that his daily life practically does not depend on what state of consciousness he is in. He remembered about emptiness or forgot. Conversely, no events in his life influenced the established cyclicity of these states. He had hoped to use lucid dreaming, but was faced with a surprise. Previously, daytime stressful situations were resolved in a dream, but now the dreams have disappeared. He just woke up in a good mood. Lucid dreams came to him only after Easter parties. When John returned from death's door a few hours later, he wasn't thinking about the immortal soul he'd never believed in. Instead, he was overcome by a strange indifference. The idea of personal survival seemed unimportant, as did worries about the future. There was only one thing that mattered: life here and now. At the same time, his perception remained clear and calm, in no way resembling a narcotic trance. Every moment I lived brought joy, but the result lost its former significance. He was freed from obsession with the future, and not for a few minutes or days, but as it turned out, forever. Even a decade after his near-death experience, thoughts about the future did not bother him at all. However, he did not realize this immediately. In the very first minutes after returning, all his attention was focused on two strange questions. Why did he wake up in the hospital at night, and why is a policeman sitting at his feet? Everyone around him fell asleep, making sure that he had survived, and John himself felt refreshed and refreshed. Moreover, he did not just come to his senses, but was reborn, just like his memories of himself. It had just been created by the endless blackness. He was sure that time had stopped completely, and before that he had really died. And it didn't matter if this death lasted for hours or just a fraction of a second. At the threshold of death, his consciousness faded away, and when, after a long struggle, the doctors had already despaired of bringing John back to life, it turned on again. The endless, eternal dark consciousness focused, and his personal perceptions started working again. John argued that his near-death experience contradicts the conclusions drawn on the basis of numerous published testimonies, where personal consciousness appears to be independent of the brain. At the moment of approaching clinical death, he was in nirvana, in its original meaning, that is, in a state of extinguishment. This question divides researchers. Some believe that since there is an eternal consciousness that does not cease its activity, it means that it does not depend on the brain. Others agree with John, arguing that his mind was fading and behaving the same way as his body. Ren-Lewis himself, having lived decades after his experience, insisted that his consciousness had become different, and not in small things but in fundamental aspects. According to him, consciousness returned gradually, moment by moment. And when he fully recovered, he felt as if a cataract had been removed from his eyes. Suddenly, he saw and understood the essence of everything, and he welcomed this new world, in which there was still a sleeping nurse, a vase of flowers by the bed, the smell of a hospital toilet, and the coughing of patients. Then he remembered the words from the book of Genesis, and God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now he understood them fully. God approves not only of beauty, sunsets and sunrises, the scent of flowers, the singing of birds, but also of what people call diseases, ugliness, and evil. His perception of evil has changed. It has become the same as that of the dark eternity, accepting and all-encompassing. At least, that's what John himself thought. The main difference in the drama of his experience, in his opinion, was that it was not just a vivid memory and not just a change in outlook on life. His consciousness had really transformed. Until his last days, he remained in that very mystical state, which he called the eternal dark consciousness. And it accompanied him not only in his dreams, but also in reality. John also talked about dreams and near-death experiences. Many before him drew parallels between them, claiming that what they experienced on the verge of death was like dreaming. However, Lewis himself considered such a comparison untenable. His dreams and experiences in clinical death were completely different states. He was not shy about criticizing other people's views, believing that he had every right to do so. His difficult childhood and his dislike of local churchmen made him a staunch atheist opposed to Christianity. Over time, his attitude softened, but he continued to reject mysticism and was an active participant in the Death of God movement. John did not consider that he had survived death. He had gone beyond it. At some point, he became something more than an ordinary person, and therefore the personal almost ceased to interest him. However, he felt that the personality of John Ren-Lewis was always present, and if he wanted to, he could look at it differently. He believed that he had the rare good fortune to experience what is said in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Near physical death, you suddenly realize that you are not an independent person, but only a microscopic part of your true self, infinite vitality. When he finally came to his senses in a Thai hospital, he decided to apply a technique that he often practiced with his wife, which helped him return to sleep. But instead of sleeping, he found himself in an unusual darkness. John compared it to what one woman who had experienced clinical death described. I was enveloped in a very calm blackness, a soft, velvety black. and this darkness filled her with such happiness that her changed appearance amazed the friends who met her at the hospital. To accurately convey his condition after coming out of anesthesia, John quotes Carl Jung, "There comes a moment when the operator gets into the black sun, experiencing a noticeable lack of light. But John found himself in another darkness, a shining one. He called it a deep but blinding darkness." He found similar descriptions in religious texts. Psalm 138 says that the night is as bright as day. The Prophet Muhammad mentioned the night of power. Saint John of the Cross described God as a dark cloud illuminating the night. Ren-Lewis saw this as confirmation of his thought. This darkness was akin to the one that existed at the creation of the world. Moreover, in the sacred texts, the emphasis is always not on darkness, but on light. Some people who have experienced near-death experiences have described a similar state, absolute darkness in which nothing can be seen, but at the same time it gives the most wonderful, anxiety-free experience imaginable. John remembered, "I understood that all the difficulties of life were behind me. I returned home. Everything was in this shining darkness, space, time, but at the same time there was nothing, no boundaries, things or separate entities." That is why the Buddhist understanding of nirvana is close to him. The Buddha explained to the monks, nirvana is not just bliss or joy, but a state beyond joy, complete peace, very calm blackness, in which there are no worries. When John, using a special technique, tried to return to sleep after surgery, he suddenly found himself in a nirvanic state. And then he realized that this condition had not disappeared, it was just now manifesting itself in a different form. Another effect of this transition was the complete lack of time in nirvana. It is no coincidence that some esoteric texts say that God created in timelessness. Once in this state, John realized why this was so. It solved a well-known paradox. If God is everything, then how can there be anything else? The answer was that there is no time in the presence of God. God creates space and time within himself, for people as explained in the Jewish Kabbalah. John notes that when he woke up in the physical world, he did not feel a single drop of regret. He felt that the world of nirvana was still with him, although not everyone could always see or feel it. When he read from Meister Eckhart, "The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me," he was amazed at how accurately these words reflected his own feelings. Until his death, John felt the presence of the nirvana world next to him, without the slightest signs of weakening this feeling. Even if at the beginning, after his experience in Thailand, it seemed to him that this feeling was slipping away, he quickly returned it. It was only necessary to think about what he was missing in life. Over time, this feeling has become permanent. Each time he returned, he began with a feeling of shining dark emptiness in the back of his head. At the same time, despite the deep understanding that he has become more ordinary than before, there have been no changes in his life. He did not spend more time in meditation, did not give up meat or wine, continued to watch TV and react to the funny moments of life. He especially liked the Chinese saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood and draw water. After enlightenment, chop wood and draw water." However, one change did occur. The fear of death disappeared. And not because he knew about the world beyond, but because there was detachment. The keen desire for good things was gone, but if they came, for example, an evening sunset, a pleasant conversation, delicious food, he enjoyed them completely. This was how the fullness of life manifested itself, here and now. When he caught a cold, even the time spent in bed, as well as the feeling of a sore throat and stuffy nose, brought pleasure. It was the surprise of a new life. There were headaches, for example, and they temporarily pushed the new consciousness aside, but this changed over time. The openness to emptiness gradually descended from the back of my head to the middle of my back, and the hissing in my ears, which had previously irritated me, began to resemble a magical sound, like meeting an old friend. Even the fatigue and slight pains of an elderly body began to bring pleasure. Then the feeling of openness to emptiness descended to the buttocks, as if forming a reverse kundalini force in Hinduism, which usually rises up the spine. And although aspirin was sometimes needed, John continued to enjoy life until his last days, grateful for this universe. John Ren-Lewis, a researcher and a man with an unusual outlook on life and death, had a near-death experience that radically changed his perception of the world. At the time of his clinical death, he had not experienced traditional sensations such as watching his body or traveling through a tunnel of light. Instead, he found himself in a void where he felt neither time nor space. But this state was for him the most intense blissful life. Subsequently, he felt his consciousness transformed. It seemed to him that the upper part of his skull had been removed and his brain was placed in the boundless cosmos. This experience left a deep mark, and John began to perceive himself as a microscopic particle of infinite darkness that manifests itself at every moment, then being John, then disappearing into the void. After the experience, his view of the world and his own personality changed. He began to perceive life as something endless, in which time and space became irrelevant. He was convinced that each of us has a memory of our true selves, but most forget about it from birth. Remembering his true self through near-death experience, he came to realize that life after death did not matter because he had already experienced immortality, and this state did not depend on his physical body. John claimed that he had not just returned to life, but had experienced a rebirth where time had stopped and death no longer caused fear. This change came not because of knowledge about the afterlife, but because of a feeling of complete detachment from life and the future. In his life, only the here and now became important, enjoying every moment, whether it was an evening sunset or socializing with loved ones. Pain, such as headache or fatigue, became pleasant surprises for him, and fatigue and physical ailments were perceived as new opportunities. John also noted that he did not feel fear of death because he was no longer attached to the physical world, nor had he experienced any changes in his life. He continued to live as before. He ate, drank, and did his usual things. However, despite this, he felt that the presence of nirvana, the feeling of emptiness, remained with him constantly, and this was the main change in his perception of the world. He also understood that this experience is related to the fact that time and space do not exist outside of human perception, and that God creates space and time inside himself for people. John believed that he had not experienced death in the usual sense, but had gone beyond it and looked into the very essence of God and the universe. His experience turned out to be much deeper and broader than traditional ideas about the afterlife. He did not experience a meeting with deceased relatives, did not visit heaven, but looked into the shining dark void that existed before the beginning of the world. In recent years, his thoughts and observations on clinical death and life after it have become increasingly relevant and arouse considerable interest, as skepticism on this topic has significantly weakened. Dear friends, write in the comments what you think about this. Dear friends, thank you for watching my video to the end. If you liked it, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you, and have a nice day.